A major hurdle cleared to get the Iran nuclear talks going. Tehran and the world nuclear watchdog extend an agreement to monitor atomic sites. So, can this help to put an end to some sanctions on Iran and revive the 2015 deal? This is Inside Story. I'm Rob Matheson. This is Inside Story. A fifth round of negotiations between European powers and Iran to save the nuclear deal got underway in Vienna on Tuesday. Just 24 hours before that, Tehran agreed to a month-long extension to a deal which allows the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA as it's known, to inspect Iran's nuclear facilities. That pact had originally been agreed back in February for a 3-month period. It was a way to get round a bill passed by Iran's parliament to suspend surveillance. The bill also set a February deadline for European signatories to give relief from oil and banking sanctions.
This is like an emergency device that we came up with in order for us to continue having these monitoring activities, while at the same time recognizing the fact that, as you all remember, there was a law passed by the Parliament of the Islamic Republic of Iran, suspending a number of rights. So we had to find some way.
Well, this latest concession coincides with the selection of candidates eligible to become Iran's new president in next month's election. Asad Beg in Tehran explains the significance of the step and what Iran hopes to get out of the talks.
Now, the extension of this deal with the IAEA comes at a time when Iranian negotiators have returned to Vienna to try and revive that 2015 nuclear deal. Although it's important to note that this extension with the IAEA is only for a month, unlike the 3 months that it was agreed back in February. Now, the government spokesman has been speaking about this agreement, and this is what he had to say.
این نتیجه گرفته شد که مذاکرات مسیر رو به پیشرفتی رو طی میکنه و
The temporary deal between Iran and the UN nuclear agency was extended by the Supreme National Security Council for a month because reports suggested talks in Vienna are progressing. This is a signal of Iran's seriousness and goodwill gesture. We hope it can be a sign to the P4+1, the United States and the IAEA that Iran is adamant to reach an agreement. The only response to this goodwill is the return of all parties to the JCPOA and implementation of their commitments under the UN Resolution 2231. This is a limited opportunity, and we don't plan to get engaged in talks of attrition.
دور نیست این تمدید یک ماه صورت گرفت.
Now, we know the parliament here, which is dominated by the conservative opposition, were never happy with that 3-month agreement. In fact, they accused President Hassan Rouhani and his government of going against the legislation. They only backed off once it emerged that the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei had given that 3-month deal his blessing. Now, President Hassan Rouhani and his Foreign Minister Javad Zarif have been public about their opposition to that legislation. That legislation called for restricting IAEA inspectors on certain nuclear sites and also for recordings, video recordings, to be turned off. Now, they said that it wasn't helpful and that Parliament should allow diplomats to do their job. But time is running out. Presidential elections are less than a month away, and the United States and the European powers may be faced with a president and a government that is far more hostile to negotiations than current government led by President Hassan Rouhani. But the government here has said that an attempt to revive that 2015 nuclear deal and have those US sanctions lifted is close. But the question is, how close? Because any agreement reached or any news of sanctions being lifted could be used by candidates wanting to be Iran's next president. Asad Beg, Inside Story, Tehran.
Okay, let me take you back a bit to how all of this began. In 2018, former US President Donald Trump pulled the US out of the nuclear accord, calling it the worst deal ever negotiated. Trump reimposed sanctions on Tehran, including on a foundation controlled by Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. Tehran responded by scaling back its commitments to the deal and enriching its uranium levels beyond the agreed cap. European signatories, along with China and Russia, are trying to maintain both the deal and business with Tehran. Iran wants sanctions lifted before it fully complies with the accord, but the US says Iran must curb some of its nuclear activities before it's prepared to rejoin. Okay, let's bring in our guests. In Tehran, we have Hamed Mousavi. He's a professor of political science at Tehran University. In Washington, D.C., Hillary Mann Leverett is a former national security official and diplomat. And in Vienna, Tariq Rauf is a former head of verification and security policy at the coordination officer at the International Atomic Energy Agency. Thank you very much indeed, all of you, for being with us. Tariq, I'd like to start with you. Why else do you think has Iran agreed to this extension other than just a willingness to hold the talks?
Well, I think the senior officials at the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, headed by Dr. Salehi, who is also the vice president of Iran, they understand that providing cooperation to the IAEA as regards nuclear verification is in Iran's own interest, and that were the agency to report that it is unable to verify, that would play very badly. So the AEOI has been cooperating with the IAEA. And I should add that despite the media talk, the IAEA is not running blind. Iran is still implementing fully and without any restrictions its comprehensive safeguards agreement under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the bedrock of IAEA inspections. And even though they have restricted some IAEA access at Natanz and Fordow, under the safeguards agreement, the IAEA still is able to verify. And next week, we expect a report where the IAEA will provide details. And let me just mention that 2 weeks after the sabotage at Natanz, which took place on the 10th of April, the IAEA reported that there were about 8,300 centrifuges enriching at Natanz, at the very place where the sabotage took place. 5,060 IR-1 centrifuges are in the same configuration as from 2015. So it suggests that the sabotage was not successful in either disrupting the enrichment program nor in disrupting the Vienna talks.
I want to ask you briefly about a statement that was made by the head of the IAEA in the last 24 hours or so when this agreement, this extension was put forward. He referred to the fact that it was very significant that data collected up to this point would not be deleted, but there had been a risk that it would be under the previous agreement. Just for those of us who don't really understand the finer parts of this, why is that so important?
Well, there are different electronic devices that are installed in enrichment plants, such as Natanz and Fordow. They measure, for example, in real time, the level of enrichment. This is called the online enrichment monitor. And this part has been, in a sense, Iran has said that this particular data will not be provided to the IAEA. On the other hand, the IAEA still has the obligation to verify the level of enrichment and the quantity of nuclear material, and you will hear about this next month. So what Iran has done is it has sort of provided some obstruction to the IAEA in collecting some data, but not all data.
Hamed Mousavi, some parts of Iran's leadership have made it clear that they think the 2015 deal was a bad deal for their own reasons, and it was bad for Iran. How surprising is it that this extension was granted?
I think it shows that the deal is actually supported by the highest levels of the Iranian government. And I'm not only talking about the Rouhani government, because decisions made in the Iranian National Security Council have to be approved by Iran's supreme leader. So essentially, this extension was approved by the leader. Nevertheless, I think the fact that it was only extended for a month and not 3 months like before, I think it shows growing impatience, especially from the conservative circles in Iran. Many of Iran's current lawmakers were very critical of the deal in 2015. And we have to remember that we have Iran's presidential election in less than 4 weeks. And it's very likely that Ayatollah Raisi is going to win. And he has been very critical of the deal from the beginning. So I think the clock is ticking, and as more time passes, it will actually become more difficult to reach an agreement.
Hilary Mann Leverett, the Biden administration has been criticized particularly by Iran for seemingly not to do anything about sanctions in the first 3 to 4 months that it has been in existence. Is there an argument for suggesting that the Biden administration has actually been playing a long game? We have the elections coming up. One would imagine that if sanctions were able to be agreed to some degree prior to or during those elections, it would make it easier for an eventual president to sell the deal to the Iranian people. Is there anything within that suggestion that this is actually a strategy by the Biden administration?
Well, I think there is a strategy by and within the Biden administration, and there's not actually consensus for it, but there is a strategy, and it has to do much more with U.S. domestic politics than Iranian domestic politics. The Iranian domestic paradigm, or the issue, is coming up really soon at the end of June. But here in Washington, the focus for President Biden, from what I understand, and within the Biden administration, is on the midterm congressional elections here in the United States next year in 2022. The Senate here is almost evenly divided. If the Democrats lose just one Senate seat, then the Democrats lose control of the Senate, and Biden's entire domestic agenda is in jeopardy. And from what I understand, that is the focus, that Biden has not wanted to in fact, rejoin the Iran nuclear deal as it was in 2015, because it would have called on the United States to lift, not just waive, not just suspend, but actually lift sanctions on Iran with the cooperation and implementation done by the U.S. Senate. That was not going to happen, and Biden did not want to waste, in his view, his domestic political capital here pushing through an Iran nuclear deal that only has lukewarm support. And so what you see on the U.S. side is very much a focus on doing almost as little as possible to contain the status quo. The problem was that Iran wasn't being contained. Israel was killing Iranian scientists, was blowing up the Natanz nuclear and other facilities. There was essentially this hot conflict percolating and even potentially exploding between Israel and Iran that President Biden was afraid would backfire on the United States, drag us further into the Persian Gulf, and again ruin President Biden's domestic agenda, and to the extent he has a foreign policy interest at this point, focusing on an emerging conflict with China. And so those are the calculations here. It's very much of a lukewarm embrace of the Iran nuclear deal, one the Biden administration is pursuing with some real reluctance because of U.S. domestic politics. It's very different than it was under the Obama administration.
I want to talk to you more about the role of Israel in this, because we're seeing U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, obviously, in Israel at the moment. He's been holding a press conference with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who took the opportunity to reiterate Israel's determination that Tehran, that Iran should not become a nuclear threat. Given the strength of feeling that Israel has about this, that it would take the opportunity during ostensibly talks about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to raise this matter again, how difficult is that going to make these negotiations with Israel very strongly on the sidelines?
I think it's very important, and it's central. The role of Israel in the U.S.-Israel relationship is absolutely central to what's going on with Iran. Secretary of State Blinken is in Israel as we speak, and he is talking about Iran. It's not so much what happened in Palestine. It's really about Iran and the Israeli Prime Minister's determination to continue his very aggressive militaristic campaign against Iran. And again, it comes back to the U.S. domestic politics. I cannot emphasize this enough. President Biden, unlike President Obama, is a creature of U.S. domestic politics. He spent nearly 40 years in the U.S. Senate and as a U.S. vice president. For him, it really comes down to U.S. senators. The Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, is absolutely a pro-Israel hawk in U.S. domestic politics. The chairman of the U.S. Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, Senator Menendez, is again a very hawkish pro-Israel member of the Senate. Biden is focused on Israel and U.S. domestic politics. And to the extent that he differentiates himself from the Obama administration, it's about Israel, and that is central. I want to just add to this. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo from the Trump administration is also on his way to Israel, because he understands that for Biden, having the U.S.-Israel relationship in a good place is critically important for Biden, and it's critically important for Secretary Pompeo's prospects to run himself for president in 2024. I know this gets into a lot of the nitty-gritty, but in terms of what's driving the U.S. agenda here with Iran, it is very much U.S. domestic politics and the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Tariq Rauf, I want to ask you a little bit more about the nature of the deal itself. The U.S. says Iran needs to dismantle some of its nuclear activities before the U.S. is going to rejoin the deal. What do you think the U.S. would need to see to get it to a position where it would be willing to rejoin that deal?
Well, that's a very good question, because it's not only the United States, but also the three European powers. What I understand is their view is that since Iran stepped out of the JCPOA limits on enrichment, starting in the summer of 2019, it has gathered a lot of experience and expertise in operating the centrifuges, in enriching to 20%, and now also enriching up to 60%. And that somehow this experience and expertise needs to be rolled back as well. Not only that the extra centrifuges are mothballed and taken offline, but that the data that has been accumulated over the past 2 years or so is also erased. And this is something very difficult because there's no way of verifying this. I understand Iran is not prepared to do that. It is also arguing for maintaining some of the advances that it has made in operating the more advanced centrifuges. And it says this is, in a sense, compensation for the economic damage suffered by Iran as a result of the Trump sanctions, and also the human cost to the Iranian population, many of whom apparently have suffered and died because of lack of medications for cancer, COVID, and so on. So it's a very complicated agenda on both sides. And finally, Iran also says that the last time around in 2015, the JCPOA was front-end loaded. Iran had to take all the technical actions, and then the JCPOA came into effect. Now they want to see the U.S. sanctions removed, the benefits to flow to Iran, and then they would be prepared to take more significant steps in rolling back the enrichment program to the 2015 levels.
Hamad Mousavi, do you have any impression of how far back, if you like, that rollback could go within Iran in terms of erasing data and essentially unlearning expertise that it has developed over the last few years? That seems a very tall order.
Yes, I think the expectations from Iran are very high from the other side. I mean, unlearning the expertise they have gained in the past 2 years is almost impossible. I mean, they can erase the data perhaps, but the expertise is going to be there. Nevertheless, we've seen very little flexibility from the other side regarding Iran's demands. As was mentioned, there's the issue of choreography. I mean, who takes the first step and how is that verified? Iran is worried that the Biden administration is only going to remove the sanctions on paper, and Iran is not going to reap the benefits. So Iran wants to actually be able to sell its oil and transfer the money from foreign banks to Iran, and then be able to take its side of the deal, to implement its obligations under the deal. And so far, the Biden administration has not accepted that. There's also the issue of all the sanctions that were implemented during the Trump administration, apparently over 1,000 sanctions. And some of these sanctions, they're labeled under terrorism or human rights, etc. And Iran's position is that it wants all of these sanctions to be lifted. And the reason for that is if some sanctions remain, then essentially that's going to muddy the water for foreign firms and foreign investors. It's going to be very difficult for them to tell if they are abiding by some sanctions and, other sanctions that have been removed. It would be a very complicated picture. And again, on that front, what we're hearing is so far the Biden administration has refused to take out all of the sanctions. There's also the concern from the Iranian side that if some of these sanctions remain, they are going to be used as leverage for future negotiations. I mean, the Biden administration has already talked about a so-called bigger and better deal, and that's not something that Iran really wants. Iran feels that when the U.S. is saying a better deal, it means a better deal for them and a worse deal for Iran.
Hillary, you were talking earlier about the fact that the Biden administration is essentially seeing this through the lens of domestic politics. In your experience, how far do you think the administration would be prepared to go without jeopardizing the domestic politics element that you have been talking about?
It varies from administration to administration. You know, I've served in several. I served in the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, and I've watched all of these administrations up close. And I think for President Biden, he is really the most knowledgeable politician in terms of the U.S. political system, what he can get done and what he thinks he cannot get done. So I think Hamid's concern, or his point about a U.S. reluctance to lift sanctions that were redesignated or double designated under President Trump as terrorism related or human rights related, is a very important consideration. For President Biden, it's going to be very difficult to say that he's lifting sanctions or waiving sanctions or even temporarily suspending sanctions on Iran if they've been designated under the rubric of terrorism or human rights. That's going to be a difficult sell for him domestically, and one that, from what I understand, the Biden administration is very reluctant to take on. Again, I think President Biden is looking to contain Iran as much as possible. And I also think Hamid's point is important about the Biden administration looking forward. For them, it's almost a necessary evil to get the JCPOA back, back on the table and everybody signed up to it. Because the real goal for the Biden administration is to move on to the next step, to try to, what they call, contain Iran's nefarious or malevolent behavior with regional parties outside of Iran and on its human rights situation and its missile capability. Those are the real focal points for the Biden administration, and they do want to have what they call as much leverage as possible going into those future talks. In my view, they're really going to undermine themselves, even having the opportunity for future talks, if they don't more realistically engage to come back into the JCPOA. But that's the calculation within the Biden administration: 100% political, 100% focused on the next categories of talks. Again, because of U.S. domestic politics, because in U.S. domestic politics, that's what they care about: Iran's relationship with Hamas, with the Palestine Islamic Jihad, with Iran's missile capability. That's where American domestic politics are, and that's what Biden needs to contain in order for him to pursue his domestic political agenda.
Hamid, just very briefly, we only have a couple of minutes left. The only leverage Iran to outsiders appears to have is the threat of ramping up its enrichment process and working towards eventual weaponization of the nuclear process. Obviously, that is a concern that nobody outside of the process wants to see happen, but is there going to come a point, do you think, where if these talks fail or they're stalled and sanctions are not lifted and nothing moves, that Iran is going to have to use that leverage? And we could see a point where Iran is almost forced into weaponizing its nuclear capabilities and then, of course, opening itself up to the risk of attack from outside countries such as Israel.
Well, at least at the moment, there's really no talk, even among the most extreme conservative circles in Iran, regarding weaponization. And there has been a clear fatwa or a Islamic ruling by Iran's supreme leader against such a move. And it would be very difficult, even from a public relations perspective, to reverse that. Nevertheless, what they are talking in conservative circles is for Iran to put the deal aside and instead to become closer to the East, especially to China. Iran is already selling close to 1 million barrels of oil per day to China, even though the sanctions exist. So their solution, if you like, is not to actually build a bomb, but go towards the Eastern camp and essentially build Iran's power through relations with China and with Russia.
Hamid Mousavi, thank you very much indeed. Well, I want to say thanks to all our guests, Tariq Rauf, Hilary Mann-Leverett and Hamid Mousavi. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @InsideStory. From me, Rob Matheson, and the whole team here. Bye for now.